Philosophically, for me, one of the interesting things about AI, which those of you who know these series will know that I think is misnamed, it's neither artificial or intelligence. Its biggest danger is it artificializes our intelligence. And yet, one of the things about it that is almost positive to an old 17th and 18th century philosopher like me is that it overthrows the post-Kantian orthodoxy about where the mind is, Now, here I have to be careful, because the orthodoxy doesn't really get itself properly established until the mid-19th century, because there's the entire flirt of Romanticism. But then it is established. What that orthodoxy does is it takes basically the Aristotelian vision of the soul, calls it the mind, and makes all thought happen within it. Intelligence, then, is owned by minds. Thought happens in minds. And the kind of philosophy I've always loved, that's not the case. You don't need a mind to think. I'll give you an example. Your lower gut, which has more neurons than many creatures have in their brains, is clearly thinking in its own way. I don't understand thought only through having a brain with one recognizable mind. But from possibly the end of the 18th century, beginning, I guess I would say, with Berkeley. After all, Berkeley said essence is perception, and wanted to have, therefore, each individual relationship with reality a product of their minds, and their minds alone. The person who perceived it, and their relationship with God. And through Hume, although I would totally dispute that, but I might be controversial, certainly to Kant, there was this great orthodoxy. Oh, minds might be made something. You might be able to think the thought that allowed you to think at all. But in the end, what mattered wasn't thought. Wasn't the great idea of Descartes that thought was an attribute shared throughout the creation, and that all of creation in its different ways was thinking. Now here I've actually gone from Descartes to his successors, to Leibniz and Spinoza. Descartes doesn't quite say that, and is much closer to the standard mind-body problem. But that's because he doesn't really believe in bodies, if total truth candor speaks, and has a very inadequate theory of matter. But the fundamental doxa of the 17th century rationalists was you had to understand thought as something in its own right, something separate from the mind. It was an attribute of God. It was that which defined the monad. And yet in defining the monad, it created individuality inside itself. Now, the idea then that you have to have an agency doing the thinking is always one of the great, for me, it is one of the unpleasant legacies of philosophy. For so many different reasons. It means that the answer to any question, for instance, what is evolution good for, must always be an agency. You're not allowed just to say, well, it just is. You're not allowed to say that, because the answer is always a soul, in the way that the thinking always is about the mind. What if it isn't? AI is clearly another attempt to understand a way of thinking that doesn't relate to a mind, that is related to maths, to that thing that gets called algorithms that none of us quite understand, but we know somehow is dominating our way of thinking. And that changes, I think, the way you have to understand all your ethics. You see, since the domination of the mind-body problem and the locating of thought within mind, everything has always been about the person, personal responsibility, personal agency, and you should have realized this, you should have realized that. And now, in this world where we accept, just blindly, there are these things called memes, that orbit the world and that take over your brain and have little thoughts inside of you, where we blithely accept that computers have something called AI that isn't a located mind, where we're starting, more excitingly, to understand how thought or processes analog to thought run across the world, not just in other parts of our body, but in the fungal roots of trees that communicate information from one tree to another. The world is full of thought. It is full of thinking. And yet we are very bad still, I think, at understanding what thought looks like when it isn't in the mind. Very bad, ironically, given it is the older idea, of understanding what an attribute of thought, devoid of personality, really looks like. Hey, I won't help you understand that, because it's laced with the personalities, the stamps of its creators. It's more of Frankenstein's monster than any sort of mirror of divinity. But it reminds us of a basic folly. Thought happens independently of the mind, and we have to understand the way we conceive of ethics and of ourselves in the light of a thought that is already thinking a me, and not in the me that thinks. If nothing else, Hei does that much for us.